Welcome to my second talk. Thank you guys for joining back again. This is going to be an hour, so that I'm respectful of people's time. And I covered a lot of topics in the first talk. It's on YouTube, and I'll link in the discussion board. But everything I am building my hypotheses related to dark consciousness on is that topic of consciousness. And in order for us to like get more advanced and do further deep dives, we need to legitimize consciousness in the cosmic framework. That's not something that exists today. So expect some like basic level conversation that we deep dive into of what intelligence and consciousness needs. And the goal again is to kind of reframe the way we sort of look at things, because of the disconnect. It affects mental health directly. And so we also provide it more of like a physical solution. And I'm hoping to use the knowledge from this research to move a little bit away from that and more into our true essence. Okay. So first, we're going to define the problem of consciousness not being a legitimate layer of our universe and what our limitations are today. So measurements and devices, the nature of using physical tools is that it is physical for us, meaning our five senses. That's how we physically communicate with our environment. And inherently, we have limited perception. We are not gods. So there is a level of complexity that gets reduced in understanding what it is and timing in experimentation. So the scientific method kind of has like not exactly what type of timing you should use, but just so that there is linear timing in general to measure things with when it comes to experimenting or testing out a hypothesis. The thing about consciousness and how it seems to show up is it doesn't operate in some vacuum. Inherently, it's intertwined with physicality, time, and space, but it seems to have its own way of operating, which can be kind of difficult to isolate in a system. Also, our society will diminish things like feelings and thoughts and experiences, excuse me, because it's just seen as corny. There's like, like a peer pressure to almost like make fun of things like an experience. And so that can end up being pretty dismissed, even though this is something that tends to affect everybody. Now, when it comes to legitimizing, how have we approached that today? So we currently don't have acknowledgement of consciousness that is a legitimate connection to the universe, like a true component and aspect of it. We just have it as a subjective aspect of ourselves. And it is so dependent upon observers on how this experience will take place, something that's personal, and then therefore it doesn't belong because it's so personal. It doesn't belong in total reality. But my question to all of that is, if we all have subjective experiences, is that not objective enough for us to think about legitimizing consciousness? For our current cosmic framework, we only account for astrophysical phenomena at the thermodynamics level, which has worked really well for us so far, all the way down from big galaxy systems to actual physical medication. And, with the problem of consciousness, there's multiple frameworks and definitions of this. You can also think of different belief systems and faiths and how they think about it. And then how philosophers think about it, atheists think about it. And so inherently, this creates so much complexity, which is literally the nature of consciousness to have that complexity. So people kind of just dismiss it because there's this conflict of we can't all agree on one thing of what this is. So coming from my first talk, my hypothesis with this is that the external cosmos, our reality that we see, is a projection of our inner consciousness, more specifically holographic, and that the cosmos have a consciousness layer of reality in addition to the physical thermodynamics layer. So, referencing back my first talk again, pulling from Tantric philosophy, which states that there's two sides of the same coin of reality called Shiv and Shakti. And this was again like a mythological way of making astrophysical, quantum physics related phenomena accessible to the common human being. And so this image is a representation of that. The Shiv layer is pure consciousness, coherence, think quantum mechanics, infinite possibilities, thought matter, meditation, stillness. If we wanted to get astrophysical with it, you could call it dark matter. And then the Shakti layer would be what we end up seeing in our reality, what we observe, which is all pulling from a layer of physicality, thermodynamics, this aspect of decoherence because something kind of took form, it was observed, it collapsed into a physical layer, it's tangible 3D matter, it's expression, it's movement. And if you want to get astrophysical with that, it would be a form of dark energy. So I've kind of built this framework on how can we start measuring the legitimacy of consciousness because there needs to be a structure about it that's able to be digestible by every human being universally. So the first thing I thought of was efficacy and frequency. Is everything affected by consciousness? And is it affected by consciousness all the time, 24/7? My next measure, I started thinking of like, okay, the aspect of gravity that's seen as legit. Everybody seems to agree on it, unless you're a wild conspiracy theorist. And so I was like, what is it about, gravity that adds to its legitimacy? And where does consciousness kind of have like a gap? And so there's this little nifty chart I put together where really you can read it for yourself, but the issue that we see is with measurability. So gravity has a indirect measurability with force and how other elements are affected by its force, and they have a unit of measurement. With consciousness, there's indirect measurability, but also the way it impacts systems is not as consistent as the way gravity tends to operate, which is one of the issues. The other issue is there's no universal unit for measuring consciousness. I mean, really, you could go do, I see a neurologist myself, like you can do MRI scans, all sorts of brain scans, check out brain waves, and there's ways of physically measuring it. But again, you'd still be looking at the physical aspect of the brain. You're not looking at the mind and consciousness. That inner experience is kind of lacking. But there are observable effects. The fact that we all have it is one, and the fact that we can define it. In order to define something and have a row called definition means that we see and observe its phenomena, and then we ascribe a value to it. And like the key is definition, where the value is like explaining what it means. And so that led me to my second part of the framework, which is replicability and measurability. Can we model consciousness and experiment with it and how it presents and test it on smaller scales? I say smaller scales because it would have to be something kind of smaller than us as human beings and including us. Like something more intelligent than human beings, that would require interaction with something like that, which we haven't done as far as I'm concerned. And just kind of like a little footnote that there would have to be a level of dimensionality reduction because we would be trying to isolate the system that tends to exist everywhere. So from my first talk, I talked about Tantric philosophy having, again, with the mythology and ascribing these values that everything in the cosmos operates with creation, preservation, and destruction. Everything is a wave, everything is oscillating. So that kind of pulled me towards my third metric, which is dynamism. So when you're measuring consciousness, is it also following the structure of oscillation that the physical layer seems to creation, preservation, and destruction? And then finally, interactability and scalability. So is this, it kind of goes in line with efficacy and frequency a little bit, but are you seeing interactions with consciousness with each other in the same way you see physical objects interact with each other and have an effect on one another? And is this something that you can build a framework with at scale, at a micro and a macro scale, all the way down from like the tiniest atoms to like big heavenly bodies and black holes? So going from that framework to kind of trying to hit that first point, here are some currently accepted legitimate forms of support for consciousness. The first one is pretty basic. It's not necessarily a whole framework, but it's called qualia. It is the subjective experience of your perception. It's like if you call something gray, but like maybe the actual color you see is red. But other people are calling it gray and they're seeing actual gray. But you guys just agreed on a word, but the inner subjective experience could be the same, it could be different. And so it demonstrates the internal measurable impacts that consciousness can have on reality from your perspective. Panpsychism, which is kind of more linked to what I'm talking about, it proposes that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the cosmos and embedded in all matter, as well as supporting the universality of it in cosmic reality. Holism is really interesting. It suggests that consciousness is emerging from an interconnected system and that there's no real separation or compartmentalization. Everything is entirely linked and it is whole. And there's some Buddhist philosophy we'll be getting into in the next talk that also supports this idea, but it aligns with interconnectivity in physical laws that you would see like with gravity and electromagnetism just at a consciousness level. Emergent reality kind of builds upon holism in the sense that complex systems produce emergent properties like novel behaviors and things that can't be predicted just by standalone parts, like things that may seem so random may not be so random after all. It may just be that we are not advanced enough to be able to pinpoint really micro factors and like the multitude, perhaps the infinite number of factors that can lead to something that feels like it doesn't match our probabilistic idea of what could take place. And also correlates to the evolution of consciousness. Evolution in consciousness can manifest in multiple forms, and we typically study it in evolutionary biology. But emergence is going to be that shift that pulls from wholeness that shows continual change over time. So going back to our framework slide, yeah, we kind of touch on efficacy and frequency, just considering the fact that, these foundations, for them to be even existing means that there was a form of efficacy and frequency observed that people came up with multiple definitions and saw them as a valid point, maybe not for the reality of the entirety of the cosmos, but just a legitimate layer of reality. So I'm going to start getting a little bit into the tantric philosophy. And there's like Western under like the Western things have like tantric underpinnings to them. So you would have heard philosophies from both the West and the East. So the idea of universal consciousness is a field or layer of reality where everything comes from, including physical matter. And it is a field of pure potential before collapsing into specific states. And a lot of it could be considered to be a wave in that oscillation of creation, preservation, and destruction. And just kind of tapping into the idea of what thought is, how we define it today. So from the tantric perspective, it's a vibration. And just kind of looking online, like people see it as like a process, maybe something that lacks mass. So is it part of a physical reality that we can observe? It's from, it's an emergent property from the brain. There's electrochemical patterning that results in thought. But kind of bulling into just something I was thinking about is like, if every thought is a vibration stemming from the philosophy I'm studying, then I want to explore whether order truly matters, because then maybe you could reverse it and say that anything that vibrates is potentially a thought. And that would require getting really deep into what the concept of thought really is, which is going to continue to evolve through these talks. So the danger of consciousness elitism, something we humans are very great at. We really like to dumb down the universe to our level. And when we only view consciousness through a human lens, we just flatten that multidimensionality that can exist everywhere, right? And it's just something narrow and reductive, something we call smart, something we call valid. And if we do this, we shut ourselves sort of away from other forms of consciousness that's around us, or some level of depth and more profound interactability. Not only that, we impose our ego on nature and viewing our needs as the most important thing in this world. And it creates a disconnect between us and the rest of the universe. But some of the implications can sort of look like climate change and like trying to get to your own needs. And like that is the only reason that we're here. We're the only reason anything matters. screw everything else. And that is something that divides us from being able to achieve greater harmony, and innovation. And I don't mean technological or purely technological, I mean collaborative innovation with everything around us. So when we think about consciousness and how we want to define it, we tend to see intelligence as a symptom of it. And I kind of want to do a little bit of a different shift here as well. So I like to think of nature, being out in Colorado. I mean, you feel the intelligence when you're out on a hike, like I feel really connected and just kind of using those feelings and breaking it down more in this slide. It's this ability, to me, intelligence looks like sustaining life over long periods of time. The same way trees and ecosystems, mycelium networks create symbiotic relationships that outlast civilizations. They can go, through multiple periods of extinction and they're still here. They maintain balance and harmony. They don't have a desire to cause problems with each other. You can think of hive minds like flocks of birds or ant colonies. They resist collapse, and I like that they have distributed intelligence. They don't really have a sense of elitism of intellect. It's, all these things are kind of every element of these systems is treated as an equal. So they don't have like a single point of failure. So mycelium networks will communicate underground and they distribute nutrients and they try to communicate with each other without damage, and they don't have a central brain. And trees and forests will share resources through root networks. They act as a unified system for their survival. They're very good at also warning each other of danger that's happening in their environment, but they're not talking. It's just being able to communicate through these roots. Now, if we come back to human intelligence and implications of what it means to look at things differently, humans versus communal systems. So, human intelligence, I mean, we can see it in divides today, whether it be on social media or just like in the news, conversations. Human intelligence profits off of and definitely like creates a priority for individuality and wanting division and like hoarding like technological prowess over collective well-being. We think better when we think together, but there are clearly people who can benefit far more with power if they can get everyone sort of upset with each other and then they keep, their sense of well-being for themselves. So it's I am wanting to redefine intelligence and not talk about it as who can invent the best things in this tech reality today, but about sustaining existence in harsh conditions. There's, I think, this book called Recapture the Rapture by Jamie Wheel, and he talks sort of in the introduction about like, if we are going to get like taken by aliens or just attacked by something outside of Earth, like we are really going to turn on each other very quickly and we want to save ourselves first. We think we're the first to be prioritized by other things, but we're always planning like and plotting against each other. And that's not really what's going to help when there's like greater threats to us as people. We need to be able to survive things collectively. So, if the idea of unity in consciousness is what drives intelligence, if we look at it that way instead, then there would be a preference towards the collective model because it would mirror the interconnectedness of the universal field and therefore be more powerful and resilient throughout time. So I just wanted to touch on the concept of thoughts and universal consciousness. I thought that was cool. The example is daydreaming, mostly because I've had an issue of maladaptive daydreaming for like 20 years. And when I was working with my CPTSD and my somatic therapist, and shifting my mindset on things and dealing with triggers, flashbacks, all of that, there would be times where I would talk about, wow, like today I had a different like thing come into my mind. I was watching it, whatever. And my somatic therapist asked me this brilliant question. She was like, um, how much are of you of those thoughts are you creating, or does it feel like you're watching something happen? And I was like, man, I mean, what an interesting question because when we're daydreaming and thinking, I guess what makes the difference between actively creating a thought, vision, fantasy, or whatever versus like viewing something is the latency, meaning a time delay. And so it's because we as humans equip effort, time with effort. And so if something happens really quickly, we feel like we're kind of watching thoughts. But it's interesting because the theory of the mind and the brain and how we work with consciousness today is that it is something that self-generates. And sometimes it feels like there's thoughts outside of ourselves or imagery we see of things. Maybe people have personal experiences here where like they don't know of something consciously and actively. Maybe it was never subconsciously presented in their lives, but they have some brand new information that feels outside of them. So how is it possible to observe something in your mind where only your thoughts are supposed to reside, but then you feel like you're observing something that feels outside of you? So if this feels outside of you, is it possible for everything to also have access to something outside of you, this layer of universal consciousness? So, I don't know how controversial this is, but my proposal is that our brain is actually a filter, not a generator of consciousness. And in moments of heightened awareness, that's why you may feel like you are able to understand something intuitively better or tap in into something that feels like a revelation. And I feel like this could, mean a lot of wonderful things, right? Because if there's an infinite set in this universal field, then your brain is grabbing a finite set of permutations and combinations from this infinite field. And I guess really where we would love to close the gap when it comes to like dark consciousness, which is not the main topic here, but just thinking forward, would be how can we resolve some of those combinations and permutations for the well-being of a human being. So it kind of makes sense considering that, like, if there's this idea, again, building upon this idea of a universal consciousness layer, and then everything else is kind of materializing from it, it would make sense that everything it gives rise to has some dimensional element of consciousness to it, depending on how you define it. And it can range from super basic to super intelligent. So we're going to insert the concept of Brahman here and consciousness multidimensionality. Brahman is also part of Tantric philosophy. It means supreme reality, that we are all a super conscious. We're all an aspect of it. And it's also considered an unchanging reality because it's infinite and holds everything. There's nothing to change. So it's where all creation arises and then everything else also subsides. It inherently holds infinite potential perceptions and dimensions. It's also a great supporter of the multiverse theory and of the idea that anything that can exist will. So something this kind of made me think about, just randomly. I mean, the idea of something existing in the universe in its multidimensionality, I guess it only can really exist because I'm there to observe it. And I guess someone can say there's an angle of something in a different direction because they were there to observe that. Without them being there, I can't really conceptualize that something is like a solid 3D thing. All we do is conceptualize in the 2D. Even right now, you're saying you live in 3D, but you're perceiving in 2D. An easy way to check that is like if you take a photo of something or if you can paint something, it just has an X and Y axis, but your idea of 3D comes from shadow and light. It doesn't really come from you actually seeing through all of those, dimensions in one. So the analogy to use here is we can think of consciousness as a self-illuminating light source. And when it passes through the prism, and we can consider the universe the prism, it refracts into infinite dimensions, creating the diversity in form and perception, which I think is pretty neat. So this multiplicity of consciousness is what you could say gives rise to depth and space and interaction, and it allows for dimensional complexity. If we work backwards, like so I was just talking about like almost consciousness in an entropic way, but if we unified everything and then if there was only one, then maybe there is only one dimension or maybe no dimension, maybe it's a singular point, right? If we're back in the super consciousness zone, everything is in its coherence. And funnily enough, there is a concept of that, right? Bindu, which we'll get into later, is like the singular dot and the singular point of everything. And it exists within shunya, which is emptiness and the void, where the concept of the universal field of consciousness also arises. And note that, like, when you're in shunya, in emptiness, you're in that state before the Big Bang took place. So everything is in its infinite potential. There is no dimensionality because nothing physically exists. You're before time, you're before existence. So we could say that because of this, perception is what creates that relativity. And then the question to ask here is if physical dimensions they're shaped by interactions of consciousness, which is just so fascinating to think about. Can we technically model the universe as a multi-dimensional map of awareness? Of course, like it has its physical existence as well. Like we see things physically happening. We study things in astronomy, but like adding that additional multi-dimensional map of awareness as kind of the catalyst for things to physically exist. Not the best image. I tried to get ChatGPT to generate some things for me, but we've been talking about this, universal field of consciousness throughout this, and I mean the texts are in Sanskrit and I'm trying to translate, but there's no conversation around like what the color of it is, what the shape is, and what it looks like. So in my mind, I had been seeing it as like a flat field, like a grid in outer space, and I can see myself as like a current node, like if I'm point A. A and B here are pretty close to each other, but if we imagine A kind of being at an opposite diagonal to B, this is about consciousness, and then there's like a distance. I'm like, well, I guess could you say the farther away you are from that other node, that other bit of consciousness, that element of it, then the more conflict you would have, the more of an opposition of thoughts you would have, the less you have in common, basically, the farther apart you are. And I was like, okay, well, that's on a flat surface. Like, that makes sense. Someone's far away from you physically, you don't understand them. Maybe if they're far away from you consciously, you don't understand them. But what if you take that flat thing and like turn it into a sphere instead, like taking a piece of paper and putting it close to each other? So all of a sudden, A and B, which are like opposites of diagonals, like now all of a sudden in this sphere, they're like really close to each other. So I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about it is a different shape, you know? Because we don't know what the shape of this field is. We're just talking about it. But then in theory, it would put A and B really close to each other. So what if we put two oppositional forces like A equals love and B equals hate? They're really far apart, but then all of a sudden, like in the spherical realm, they're very close to each other. And it made me wonder, is this why we say love and hate are opposite sides of the same coin? I don't know, just something to think about. And if we kind of look at the shape of Brahman in this way with its implications, we can see about having unity through conflict. So maybe we're not as far apart from each other as we may realize. But the idea could be that conflict and constant division and just shutting out of others is because we don't sense interconnectedness. I think looking at it in a flat field, going infinitely long, you would probably sense like, okay, that's person's going to be far away from other forever and constantly expanding farther away. But I don't know, maybe through a spherical model, it's like, hey, maybe this is a form of being interconnected. We just don't see the how. And then in Tantra, we talk about everything actually being divine. Very unfortunate for all of us, I think, because we all have people we hate, and to see them as also divine is just really annoying, and I would not like that, but technically that is how it's supposed to work because it's such a fair objective system. It doesn't mean divine as in perfect, but it just means it is a byproduct of consciousness as a whole. I thought this was interesting because if you put it in a spherical shape, it has a center you really think about it. So if there's, I don't know, could you have gravity with consciousness? I'm just putting some thoughts out here because if that's the case, then maybe it pulls everything towards unity and it's trying to do that, and maybe we are kind of opposing and it's kind of pulling, right? And it could explain why greater systems trend towards harmony and self-organization, like when we were talking about those tree networks, mycelium networks. So now we've kind of established not just efficacy and frequency, but also interactability, because it's just really amazing to think about the fact that we were able to just talk about like even conflict is a form of interaction with consciousness, but then also work with, different viewpoints and dimensionality through all of it, and how your brain works as like a filter. So there's a constant interaction with something within ourselves, outside of ourselves, with things that have like a reduced version of our consciousness and perhaps an expanded one as well. So, uh, looking back here, we have interactability. Let's think about scalability. And let's add a value of consciousness perhaps to these scales. And when I'm saying consciousness, I am not trying to go from a human point. Humans are at the origin point. I would like us to leave consciousness elitism in this conversation. So let's talk about atoms. They physically do their thing. We study them. That's cool. But there's times where they have state transitions, and I always want to ask myself why. Why are there situations like electron jumps? If there's an environmental impact, why did that environmental impact happen the way it does? Like constantly tracing the why there. Fascinating to me are bacteria and viruses, their ability to adapt to environmental pressures. They just know what to do. I haven't studied immunology and virology too much, but from what I do understand, their ability to survive is honestly inspiring to me, and how they're able to maintain this level of like, okay, this environment changed. I need to do this to adapt. Like, really brilliant. Mycelium network and fungi, they're exchanging nutrients and talking to each other in this way, maintaining their harmony. Tree root systems, I already talked about them warning each other of threats. It's a form of communication and intelligence. Animals, problem solving, emotional connectivity. We know about dolphins and elephants. I've recently learned about octopuses, octopi. They don't have a centralized brain, and it's kind of like everywhere, and they're really able to remember faces. I'm reading this book called Ways of Being by James Bridle, and it talks about like intelligence tests, like a mirror test for baboons, and can they like identify their self-concept? And not all monkeys can, but they have some of them will have a smarter instinctive ability to protect themselves and protect their young, and maintain their species in a way that's better than human beings. So that's, we think looking at ourselves and knowing this is who I am is more intelligent than like someone knowing how to survive for like years and years and years. Coming back to us as humans, though, we still have that advanced sense of self-awareness. We can even have conversations like this over a Zoom call. It's pretty profound. We're creative. We have societal organizations. Now I can't think of some in between humans and solar systems for intelligence and consciousness, so I put solar system. There's planetary and gravitational interactions. There's a level of beautiful order, because you don't see Saturn randomly plummeting in the sky towards you, and stars maintain their location in terms of how they rotate and travel. The sun always rises when it needs to, so does the moon. Um, and then, we go to galaxy. This is as high as I go, but, large scale interactions with heavenly bodies, between galaxies, maybe with black holes and all of that, with dark matter and energy. And the reason I call the scaling of consciousness as well is because of their ability to maintain themselves and survive. And maybe we should ask ourselves, what does it mean to be alive versus dead, right? The fact that these things can do it for as long as they can to the point where we can study them in depth. So we have also taken a look at scalability with this and tick marked that. So now let's take a look at all of those same levels of scaled consciousness and see if maybe they also have some level of participation in creation, preservation, and destruction, shall we? All right, let's start with atoms. So I kind of did this twofold, where it's like you can be the one doing the creating, preserving, and the destroying. You are also created, preserved, and destroyed. And so atoms, they, basic elemental structures, they form molecules and matter and maintain stability through different bondage, quantum states, and they can break down in extreme conditions or with, our work with nuclear research, same with how they are destroyed in their affected state. But yeah, they like atoms will be formed through nuclear fusion in stars, and they're preserved by electromagnetic forces, natural universal forces, and depending on what crazy cosmic activity is going on, they can be destroyed there or by nuclear fission. Moving towards bacteria and viruses. So they also contribute to ecosystems via nitrogen fixation, to create other life forms, and they sustain through their adaptation, no matter how harsh the conditions are. As far as destruction, they can cause diseases and kill human beings or ecological shifts entirely, changing how an environment operates altogether. How they're created through cellular division, replication, some type of mutation. But the mutation is also how they preserve themselves, and they evolve through that and figuring out which iteration of them is most likely to thrive in an environment. And then through modern medicine, you can destroy it with antibiotics, antivirals, or environmental changes. Mycelium networks and tree root systems are pretty similar, so I'll kind of go through these fast. Just this idea of like being able to recycle nutrients, create life. Distribution is really big for these root systems, and then helping with like I don't know what you would call the cycle, but working with decaying matter and being able to formulate new growth. And as far as how they are created from fungal spores, any form of reproduction for all the living systems, traditional living systems, sustain mutualistic relationships with plants and destroyed by deforestations and environmental factors. Again, same with tree systems, and they produce oxygen, they stabilize soil, they're good at warning each other, they help with the decaying process of other animals. But trees and root systems themselves are created by seeds, favorable conditions for their growth, symbiotic relationships between elements, the rain cycle, animals can help them survive, and they can be destroyed by like similar factors to us. And like as you advance in looking at these scales of consciousness, they kind of mimic us a little bit more and more. So moving on to animals, there's so many different types. Obviously, I'm not doing them justice here because there's different types of species and the ways they operate, but they do disperse seeds and pollinate by like eating, moving around, like even with pooping in different places, like with bears, you can help grow trees and fruit plants and all of that. And their preservation, their ability to repopulate, their hive mindset, colony mindset, and destruction is, pretty intuitive. They can kill themselves by being predators. Um, and if there's any ecosystem shift, that can affect them as well. And they're born through reproductive processes. They're sustained by their social structures they've deemed necessary for their survival and destroyed by predation, disease, and environmental changes. Human beings, my favorite, not that I have any bias, haha, but they create art, culture, tech, civilizations, and evolve them. We protect them through ecosystems and societal systems. I question mark there. Not every system we have is really great. It's protecting somebody, but I don't know if it's really protecting everybody. And with destruction, we destroy. We definitely like to have our wars and deforestation and pollute the environment. Not as mindful, but we are also created reproductive processes, but also through social relationships and like building our civilization. And we sustain ourselves individually and collectively, more so in society, we see individually. And we're also destroyed by natural causes and societal collapse potentially when we harm each other socially, when that shows up in mental health disorders quite a bit. So moving on from something that seems to have life to not have life, like solar system, I mean, they're also creating, preserving, destroying. For them, they're able to enable life on planets. I mean, for us, it's just Earth, but that's the solar system we study the most, we're the most aware of. But their preservation is bound by these gravitational forces to maintain balance. And we also impact the ecosystems, not just like on Earth, but like the planetary ecosystem through solar flares. It can look like causing harm to our environment. It can look like pretty northern lights. Asteroid collisions, if that happens again, that's kind of like an edge case. But a solar system is also created by gravitational collapse of gas clouds and eventual condensation of matter. And it's preserved by celestial mechanics, same gravitational impact, and destroyed by, if our sun blows up, supernovas, all that. Galaxies are more subtle. So as you saw, like things start replicating humans from like a small level to like finally getting to the human point. And then when you go beyond the human point, it seems to feel a little bit more subtle because for galaxies, like they create stars, black holes, cosmic structures. They maintain it through gravitational forces. They can destroy things with collision, but the way they're created, going above their level is interesting because it's a lot of it, as you can see in this chart, is by entropy, dark matter, and gravity. And it's kind of like that's why I kind of alluded towards, since gravitational stuff is more subtle, like what is something we could do to like link consciousness to the legitimacy of something that gravitational forces can have. So we've actually taken a look at both dynamism and replicability because we were able to replicate creation, preservation, and destruction at all scales. And I just want to be clear, we talked about, I know I gave examples at like a physical layer, but this is very meta, because When you're talking about things happening at a physical layer and a consciousness layer, remember I said Shiv and Shakti are it's actually blasphemy to consider them separate from each other. But for the purpose of giving a talk, you have to explain them as separate entities so we can kind of build this argument together. And um, mind you, I'm talking about this level of dynamism from this point of almost like desire, which I will be touching on, of how we want to create, preserve, and destroy. So coming back to the Shiv tattvas, we talked about Shiv and Shakti, and from the first talk, we briefly touched on the tattvas. Now, the tattvas are a bidirectional flow of um, energetic vibration. How do you go from pure coherence to decoherence? How do you go from etheric thought matter to tangible 3D matter? And then how can you kind of like go back from the gross elements, the bare bones, everything in its fullest constituents broken down all the way back up into this union, like a cosmic union back into that etheric state. And on the way down, you could also kind of look at it as a form of entropy, and then kind of going back up as a form of negative entropy, where entropy is more chaos and negative entropy is more coherence. So it kind of begs the question of like, okay, well, you talked about things being kind of not two sides of the same coin. Is there something outside of the physical universe? So because the physical universe, as you're kind of looking at this chart, I mean, this is very human coded. That's why they're talking about intelligence, ego, mind, and cognition and organs like bowels. But anyway, getting back to this. So yeah, there is a physical manifestation of things coming from the Shiv Shakti union. However, the universal field of consciousness is still at play. It is outside of it. Um, and also prior, meaning before to physical reality, before time. So in essence, I guess you could kind of say universal consciousness field is something that exists within itself and without itself. It is itself and also its creation, which is physical form. Um, Point two, it really kind of gets me. I'm trying to understand it better, but if you can see it, measure it, or observe it, you are interacting with a manifestation, not a true essence. Anything that you can perceive with your five senses, unfortunately, is in the realm of physicality. So if we can interact with it, like how do we measure and learn about something that we cannot interact it with? Even if you're thinking about your own thoughts, if you can observe your thoughts, because your thought isn't like the same as holding an apple, but like if you're able to measure it and observe it, it is still a form of manifestation, which is interesting because people debate a lot philosophically on what thought is. So if the universal field of consciousness is observed, it enters the physical layer. This really does mimic when you're thinking about like quantum computing and the way people work with qubits and isolate systems. I mentioned this in the first talk, they're not actually observing and interacting with the qubit when they put it in like a cold lab, like close to absolute zero, or they try to put it into a state of superposition. They're actually doing a lot of inference. They're sending waves out. They have like mathematical derivations, and they use lasers to kind of infer things out about that qubit. They're not literally figuring it out. So I think we can learn from that model and apply that to consciousness as well. So we talked about entropy and negative entropy or neg entropy. And let's get into that a deeper level. Entropy is going towards chaos and breakdown in general. Like if you think of a candle and you light it, then you blow it out, it's going to turn into smoke. And then neg entropy is when you are going towards order, organization, and homeostasis. So there is a little bit of a paradox here. So we talk about the universe constantly expanding and constantly breaking down. A lot of different theories on how it's going to end with heat death and all of that. So entropy is constantly increasing, but everything needs to take, and because energy is always balanced in the universe. And so when we exhibit order and the fact that we're human beings, the fact that you have a beating heart is an example of maintaining order, harmony, and organization. It means that there is something else kind of taken from the universe. You take away from the universe to put more order into you, and then that's what gives it the chaos. So both of the duality exists. So I was reading this book called The Jazz of Physics, and somebody had asked their professor what is the greatest question in cosmology, and it's why do large scale systems trend towards self-organization? So looking back at the creation, preservation, and destruction piece, if you remember, like how they like to maintain, sustain, preserve their survival. That is a big question, like why? Like homeostasis ensures survival, but what is survivability dictated by? Is self-organization the expression of an underlying universal field of consciousness? If non-living systems self-organize, which is crazy to think about, could this imply a form of cosmic consciousness guiding the process? Doesn't mean that this consciousness is going to be like, hey, galaxy, move this way. This will make you live longer. It's just organizing itself and it's non-living. It's pretty incredible as to the what and the why. So does this imply preference for stability, order, and harmony? Because sustenance is seen throughout the cosmos. I mean, we're very slowly breaking things down in the same way we are very slowly aging right now. But, there's a preference to maintain health. So when we talk about order, in consciousness studies, there's this, if I'm saying desire, you could, say desire is a tendency or direction. So if we looked at what being alive is in a different way, if we consider desire or intention as a fundamental property, do we have grounds to redefine what it means to be alive? Because depending on, I mean, I would implore all of us to sort of think for a second about why we think something is alive or not. More often than not, we're going to give it a very human definition of what alive is. And it shows in people and their diet preferences and choices where one seems more because I'm this diet, it's because these, things that I would consume are more sentient, and the other one is like more dumb. But the thing that people typically call dumb and unalive, I just called more intelligent than human beings, like plants. So, yeah, when we're talking about being alive, does it have to do with being able to be at a human level, or does it mean simply that you just want to sustain in any which way you can? If you're sustained, then you're alive. You can also think about what it means to have death, because in order to be alive, you need to have the polarity of death. And I would say that death is really just kind of a transformative process. It only appears bad to us because we need to continue our evolution. We need to ensure our survival. But the deeper you start thinking about this, you realize there's no really sense of like a bridge between alive and dead. Those are just technical terms. I mean, things are just transforming. That's it. So, is consciousness a legitimate layer? Maybe the only way to consider it legitimate is if there's no single conclusion of it. If you remember, we talked about the multidimensionality. Now, what kind of multidimensionality would it be if all of us agreed on yes? It wouldn't seem like so to me. And even asking a question like this is a form of taking measurement. And maybe there is a level of humility that we need to have that we can't necessarily figure everything out. Perhaps, I touched on like we don't want to dumb down the cosmos. What we really want to do is expand our consciousness to understand more of it. So a lot of these metrics of the framework have been checked off, everything but measurability. Measurability is a really tough problem to solve because the very nature of wanting to get a single answer for something is denying the infinite dimensionality of what consciousness has to offer. So there's got to be a whole new way we take a look at it. So, like I said, I had to create this talk as a kind of rudimentary, like, hey, this is what consciousness is. This is what I'm building everything off of. I'm legitimizing that it is a layer of consciousness or reality, and at a cosmic level throughout everything, like basically what panpsychism is saying. So, based on what we've talked about today, when I'm thinking about future talks and what's next for my own personal research, um, measurability and replicability, but in a completely different way. Like, so it all seems like a problem. Like, why do people suffer? Why do we all have different opinions? Why are people having schizophrenia? Why are they? And it's like, those are very broad questions to ask. It's really important to study things in the most genuine way possible. And outside of Eastern philosophy, I really don't see like a proper love and compassion attached to understanding consciousness in this way. And a lot of the videos I've seen, especially with like microtubules being the source of like affecting quantum mechanics, there's a video on PBS Space-Time about it, but like it's still saying that the brain is a generator of its own individual consciousness, and it's still trying to measure it from an individualistic perspective when that's not really helping us. I mean, if it was, then we wouldn't be having all the problems that we do. So now I want to build upon the structure of what comprises consciousness. How exactly is it formed and how does it exist? And because I want to focus on dark consciousness in particular, identifying aberrations, I just like that word. I could have used anything, but I just like aberrations in the consciousness layer. So thinking of the infinite field of universal consciousness as a wave function constantly in existence, constantly moving. Also remember, in quantum mechanics, there's a concept of zero point energy, meaning that even in the most still system, something is still very at a microscopic level, not perceivable, but it's still moving. And so as long as anything can move, there is an opportunity for some type of creation or evolution. And with identifying, where the aberrations are, where the snags are between like consciousness and suffering and people's pain, especially coming out of PTSD when they have schizophrenia, psychosis, depersonalization issues, also different types of personality types that you see. How can we kind of move towards harmony and unity, not focus on like fixing things and like an objective sense of bad versus good, but like how can we move towards harmony and compare and contrast the metrics that we just used for the consciousness layer, but also can we apply it to the physical layer and vice versa? And I think something exciting to think about too is like I don't shy away from counterpoints and rebuttals, so I'm going to intentionally be putting that into slides just to have a little fun and see if we can't get to the bottom of just what the hell is going on in the universe. But yes, this is a shorter chat today. Thank you all so much for listening to everything. Again, like I said, I'm trying to build a second career and I'm just working off my savings. So if you find any of this content valuable, useful, it adds to your life, I hope it does. Then if you are able to and you want to, no pressure, donations definitely help me out. But yeah, I appreciate everybody listening. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. We have a few minutes left, I think, and we can open it up to a little bit of discussion.